Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our more than 850 participants from around the world. Welcome to the 2020 Platform Strategy Summit. I'm David Verrill, Executive Director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, the IDE. I trust that you and yours are healthy in these extraordinary, challenging, and virtual times. While our team has been working remotely for months, we have been working extremely hard. Today, we'll share some of the fruits of that labor. Our summit is being broadcast through MIT Video Productions and Zoom in a webinar format. We can't see you, but we know you're there. If you are having technical issues, please send an email to webcast@mit.edu, and our customer support colleagues will be very responsive. For questions during each session, we'll use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. You can then upvote any questions you like. Our moderators, myself and Devin Cook, will provide the speakers with these prioritized questions. I should also let you know that we are recording this event for future consumption. And feel free to let us know, let the world know what is going on today via Twitter using hashtag MIT platforms. Our agenda is the typical drink from the MIT fire hose. Our event co-chairs again this year are Jeff Parker, Marshall Van Alstyne, and Peter Evans. They will start us off with a 2020 platform review and forecast, followed by Dr. Roland Bush of Siemens. We're pleased today that we will have live music during our breaks, in the morning with Stephen Page of Bare Naked Ladies, in the afternoon with Grammy Award winner Craig King. The rest of the day will feature fireside chats with Jessica Tan of Ping An, John Halamka of the Mayo Clinic Platform, Connie Chan of Andreessen Horowitz, and Scott Cook of Intuit. Joseph Pine of Strategic Horizons will lead a panel on the experience economy with Andrew Berenbaum of First Tube Media, Laura Simpson of Side Door, and Ronald Vandenhoff of Seats to Meet. For your information, the session with Jessica Tan was pre-recorded out of convenience. Before we get started, I wanted to take just a brief moment to give you a thumbnail sketch of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. We have more than 36 research projects going on at any given time. We, in the last 12 months, have put on 10 events on 5 continents with more than 7,000 attendees. We have 30 companies sponsoring project teams in the Analytics Lab, which is a course this fall. If you're interested in that, then please reach out to me. My contact information will follow. We have 24 digital fellows from industry, academia, public policy, and the press, including our newest fellow, Maria Ressa, CEO of Rappler and Time Magazine's 2018 Person of the Year. 4 years of the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, we've provided more than $5 million to organizations around the world who are using technology to reinvent the future of work. The winners of the IIC have gone on to raise more than $1 billion of venture capital, served more than 350 million people, and created more than 7,000 jobs in 43 countries. And our team has been rewarded with numerous accolades, as you can see from this list. This is the lineup of our new research themes, including Andy McAfee working on Tech for Good, Sandy Pentland working on Human AI, Renee Goslin working on the Human-Machine Interface, and newcomers John Horton working on labor economics and marketplaces, Dean Eccles working on social networks and experimentation, and Dave Rand working on misinformation and fake news. And as of July 1st, we have a new faculty director. Sinan Aral has a new book coming out on September 15th called The Hype Machine: How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. I can't think of a more timely piece of work. We have an aggressive set of activities, and we could not do any of this work without the generous support of our corporate members listed here, as well as our donors from private foundations and individuals. Most of you are joining us today for this event. A sincere thank you for all of your support. And now on with the show. I am very pleased to introduce our event co-chairs, all three with master's and PhD degrees from MIT. Jeff Parker is an IDE Digital Fellow and professor at Dartmouth College, where he runs the Master of Engineering Management program. He is co-author of the award-winning book, Platform Revolution, which gave rise to this event. His co-author on that book is Marshall Van Alstyne, professor at BU, where he's chair of the IS department. Our third co-chair is Peter Evans, managing partner at the Platform Strategy Institute with previous leadership positions at GE, the Center for Global Enterprise, and KPMG. Collectively, these three co-chairs are the preeminent thought leaders on two-sided networks in business. Jeff, Marshall, and Peter, I yield the floor to your opening presentation on platform strategies.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you everyone for being here in this virtual format. And again, I'd like to echo your thanks to Carrie, Devin, and the IDE team for the rapid pivot to put this event together. So what I'd like to share now is a set of slides and some research that Marshall and Peter and I have been doing over the last several months to really try to understand what's happened over the past year, and then to provide some guidance and a little bit of a view toward the future. So of course, you couldn't possibly ignore what's been happening in the world with the pandemic. And so I'm going to talk about that and some of the issues and the ways that firms have and organizations have adapted to that. And so this is going to draw on some work with Peter and Marshall on the pandemic stress testing platform power, but it'll also draw heavily on a World Economic Forum study with Nitin Joglekar and Jag Shrai of BU and Cambridge University, respectively. So what we've seen is that you can break down the disruption into a couple of different ways to think about it. So one is on the demand side. And of course, we've seen both precipitous demand drops as well as explosions. But there's also the supply side, or you might suffer both. And we can think of three archetypal patterns of the response to that. One is weather the storm. This is when you don't have the ability to serve other markets, and then you go quickly into resource conservation mode. So the other one that we might think about is the rapid pivot, where you can take your assets and then supply other markets. And then finally, we think of one that's ride the wave, where demand explodes and then you pretty much hang on for dear life. So don't just take our word for it. We've also got some data that the Financial Times published. And in that data, it shows two sets of responses. One is where we've seen kind of platforms and tech firms see tremendous market cap gains, up in the range of $400 billion. On the other side, and we also want to call out Meituan Dianping, which is a firm in China that Marshall has done some research with, and we'll share the results of that in a few minutes. Of course, it's not all an upside story. We've seen some tremendous disruption in the finance and energy sectors, where market cap losses have actually been in the range of up to $130 billion. So as you can see, the pandemic has had differential impacts across sectors. Now, if you look at the left-hand side and you look at those firms, of course, the FT will call those communication services, energy, information technology, but you'll recognize many of those names as the familiar platform firms that we've been studying for over a decade. So let's have a look at the negative demand shocks. So the International Energy Agency has shown how oil demand drop is actually likely to last throughout 2021 and possibly belong. And that could be for a number of reasons, either decreased economic activity or honestly structural shifts in the way that we carry out our economic activity. You can see where the flight volume in North America and across the world had a nearly immediate drop in response to the pandemic. And we saw that in other sectors as well. US restaurant spending went down to nearly zero for in-person dining, and the ride-sharing platforms also saw nearly immediate drops. And I think these firms would be representative of our archetype of kind of hunker down. And indeed, we saw in oil field services and in the oil companies furlough plans, where often the employees take some of the brunt of the attempt to conserve resources for the future, and then hopefully for the uptick. But it's not all a story of just hunker down. So it's kind of fun to think about how firms do a pivot. And so here's a story from Boston where the food truck, which many of us who went to MIT might remember the lineup, um, and of course, once college campuses close or the business districts are shut down, you would think that demand has pretty much evaporated, and that was indeed the case. However, a delightful story by Kai Risdahl and Maria Hollenhorst described a system by where uh, lunch trucks were able to serve a whole new demand stream that they hadn't previously known about, or at least that they didn't need to serve, which was out in the suburbs. So the food trucks go there, and then they're able to get to suburban communities that they didn't previously know much about, and then connect and serve to them. Now, that demand pattern tends to be a lot more episodic. So it's not that steady every day I go to the same place, because the dining experience out in the suburbs is more a dinner, and people don't want to do the same thing day after day. And so enter our familiar triangular platform structure. In this case, there's a company called Best Food Trucks, and it's able to aggregate demand information on the left hand side and then match that to the trucks on the right hand side and allow them to have a direct exchange of value. We've seen a second platform pivot, which is Bands in Town. And Peter will talk a bit more about that. But what's interesting is they have literally 58 million users. And the idea was that they would allow for those users to be able to communicate with one another, but also to be able to know when their favorite bands were in town and then go to the concert venues. Naturally, all of that activity just collapsed to zero. And so their platform pivot was to create new digital experiences. And again, to allow for music fans to have direct exchanges of value so that they could support their favorite artists, even though there was this downturn in the in person performance sort of capabilities. And again, you're looking at this triangular platform structure where the Bands in Town platform is able to observe demand patterns and then make the direct linkages, which would be difficult for the music fans to do by themselves. The next pattern that we've seen is sort of the explosion of demand and riding the wave. And indeed, this can be every bit as disruptive as the demand fall because you're trying to scale rapidly. So we've seen where Instacart is aiming to add 250,000 shoppers, and where Zoom has topped the weekly download charts for weeks or months on end. And that's the very technology that we're using here today. There's actually some concern that the tech giants, and in particular the giant platforms, are uniquely well positioned to benefit from this. And as I'll show you in a few minutes, there might be some business model and operating model reasons to think that that's the case. And Marshall will go a little bit more into some of the regulatory and policy issues surrounding this later on. On the flip side, we've also noticed a lot of demand shock. And at first, or rather, a lot of supply side shock. And at first, you might think, where is that coming from? And it turns out that labor supply has been a critical factor. So the St. Louis Fed did an analysis across different sectors. And as it turns out, when your labor force is hunkered down at home and you haven't restructured the environment for safe working conditions, and the work can't necessarily be done efficiently online, that leads to a dramatic reduction in the supply side. And so there comes a lot of reduced economic activity. You can see that on the right-hand side of this figure in a little bit more detail, and here we'll dig into the automotive supply chain. So if you go up the supply chain, you might think about microchip factories in Asia. Once those shut down, then the inventories deplete, and then perhaps in Europe, you might have a Bosch, or in North America, a Denso that would be the sub-assembly supplier that then aggregates those components into sub-assemblies and then ships them to automotive companies. And again, as the inventory depletes down, then all of a sudden the supply ceases. And the lower middle graph shows that it could take up to the end of the year for this supply side shock to recover. So you've really got two sides going on that have had a tremendous impact on the overall economy. On the supply side, we usually see the resilience or the ability to respond to supply side disruption as kind of a story about insurance, where organizations are asked, what are you willing to pay for resilience? And then the traditional solutions are, well, you can add inventory, or you can reshore and locate the supply closer to the demand. Now, by definition, that means that in steady state, those costs would be higher, or else you wouldn't have seen the long chain supply chains in the first place. What we found when we were working with a number of firms in the World Economic Forum study was that firms that have been able to make end-to-end digital connections to sense changed customer needs and demands, and then reconfigure rapidly the supply chains that deliver those needs, have actually fared much better. And through those initial interviews, that led us to think carefully about separating business models from operating models. Um, and so what we saw was that it really matters that you get the match right, because the right business model has to match up to the right operating model, where by the business model, I mean the way that you realize revenues, and the operating model is the way that you deliver value. And now if we shift back to thinking about platform business models, they tend to differ from pipelines. They tend to operate marketplaces where they take fees or percentage transaction cuts, or they facilitate and get paid for access from one user type to another. We can then look at the familiar picture, and many of you will have seen this from our presentations in the past, but let's just delineate between traditional companies where the value accumulates stage to stage to stage, and you emphasize supply chain control, optimization, but you don't really have strong network effects. Contrast that to what we've called the inverted firm or the inverted platform firm, where there's relatively more value that occurs outside the firm, and you're able to aggregate data across a wider variety of participants to facilitate matching, to sense new demand patterns, and to encourage interactions that might not previously have taken place. And so we would argue that in a time of disruption, the lower business model and operating model operating together are actually considerably more resilient and flexible. And one of the reasons for that is that these more fluid in demand and supply arrangements, where you can plug in new partners and serve new demand, allow for the ability to pivot, which means to quickly match existing supply to new demand, and the ability to scale, which is where we see quickly matching new supply to existing or increasing demand, and the ability to aggregate data end to end across markets and the supply chain allows you to see better than competitors who are traditionally operating in these vertically siloed sort of data environments. Now, none of that can compensate for a complete change in demand, but it may give firms some run room as they wait for the emergence and the recovery to some sort of steady state and new normal. And so with that, I'd like to hand off to Peter, who will talk about some of the platform talent implications of adapting to these different business and operating models.
So welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. If you recall, last year, I spoke about platform innovation, and there's no sign that platforms are stopping innovating. And in fact, they've become powerful engines of innovation. But today, what I'd like to do is turn and look at talent. We've just completed a major study of platform talent. And it's pretty clear that platforms don't run on their own. You know, we can look at the business models and the technologies that run beneath them, but a key component to actually successfully launching and running platforms is the talent that you bring on board to be able to exercise and execute on those strategies. So let me get to my next slide and ask some key questions about what's happening in the talent landscape. First question is there a race for platform talent? You know, what does the supply and demand picture look like? Second, who is looking for that talent? What kind of companies are out there looking? Third is the skills and experience. You know, what kinds of capabilities are they looking for? And then finally, how well is that recruiting process working? As I was saying, how well is that recruiting process working? So what's interesting is you would think with the collapse of demand, as Jeff mentioned, you would see a retrenchment of job offerings or job searches in the platform space, but we actually find that that's not the case. We've been tracking and watching what's been posting regarding platform-related jobs, and it looks pretty healthy. Even companies in the financial services, which have been hit by the global pandemic, are still out there hiring. Here's an example of just a few jobs that have been posted recently. American Express is looking for a senior manager for platform strategy. Walgreens, which is owned by Alliance Boots, is looking for a head of product for platform solutions. USB is looking for a platform lead for digital strategy and platforms. You've got financial, not only the financial services, but also healthcare companies looking for platform head of strategy and operations. And of course, the big platform players are out there hiring as well. So these kinds of positions are in demand. We've also seen, and this was in the works obviously before COVID, but some of the incumbent retail companies like Nike have recognized that platform strategies are important and have sought very senior, seasoned, veteran platform executives to run their initiatives. Nike tapped the former president and CEO of eBay. He was at eBay for many years and so has deep experience on how to run a platform. He started as CEO of Nike in January. And we're seeing, if you look across what's happening, for example, Twitch just hired a senior executive from Spotify. There's lots of interesting moves that are taking place at the senior management levels. We looked more broadly at what's been happening in the hiring space to get a better handle. And so this is data. We were able to analyze 11,000 job postings over the last year. So this goes back to 2019. And you can see it's really a global phenomenon. You've got companies in North America, Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa, all looking for platform talent. These bubbles are the number of jobs per company. So this represents over 2,500 companies. The big bubble you see near the center of North America there is Amazon. So you can see that they're continuing to hire a lot of platform-related jobs. And some of the tactics that companies are using, which indicate that there is scarcity in the market, is that in some cases, single roles are being reposted in multiple cities. This is one example. Here's a position for a senior director of developer relations. This is a position to manage your external developer community. This position is looking for 10 years of experience in combined developer relations, software development, and partnerships to really drive their ecosystem strategy. And you can see that they've posted the same role in 16 different cities across the US, really to tap, I guess, into those local markets. So it's interesting that there's these companies that are seeking national and in some cases global initiatives, but they really need to zero in on the local markets to be able to tap into or at least post and publicize the positions that they're seeking. So who's looking? We find that when you break out kind of the most active players in the market, there are really three kinds of companies. One are what I call the replenishers. These are the existing native platform companies that are either continuing to grow, as Jeff pointed out, they've seen a surge in demand, and so they need to hire people to meet that, but also to replenish attrition and things of that nature. So they're out in the market very actively. Then you have the builders, which are the startups, and they may have reached an inflection point where they need to build out more staff, and so they're in the market. But probably the biggest players are actually incumbents that we don't necessarily see listed in typical lists of platforms, but have adopted platform strategies, and they need the talent to be able to drive those initiatives. So what are the key roles? There are really about 6 that you see when you kind of go through dozens of these job postings. One are around platform strategy. There's quite a number of roles that are posted that are actually seeking explicit knowledge around how to formulate, drive, create the roadmaps, both from a market perspective, but also a technology perspective. Then you have platform product management, which is an interesting category. These are the people that are put in charge of actually running the platform, which is a multidisciplinary kind of role. Then you have the platform ecosystem managers, and these come a variety of titles. They can be network, partner, all sorts of different titles for this role, but it's really about that inverted firm strategy of managing your external ecosystem. And then you have platform engineers. These platforms are often big, complex, and they're also changing. You don't just set up a platform and leave it. You're constantly evolving it and improving it. And so to do that, many companies are seeking engineers that understand platforms and are running platform strategy from an engineering standpoint. Then you have a whole data, we talk a lot about data, but you need to put people in charge of helping to manage the strategies around data aggregation, data management, both the technology as well as the policy and governance internal to the firm. And then we're also seeing an increasing number of platform privacy and compliance as the regulatory landscape changes, and Marshall is going to speak to some of the regulatory issues. You need people in the company that are really focused on that, and the complexity in that area is increasing, and so you need specialized talent for that. Now, when you look historically, there's been a recognition that putting in place these information systems, IT systems, really require what people call a T-shaped talent. You need deep technical expertise, but you also need these broader competencies. But when you look and analyze the platform talent, you really need the T-shaped people plus. And the range of capabilities that the job postings indicate is actually quite complex. They're looking for people that understand communications, thought leadership, can do solution architecting and communication and advocacy and evangelism. They also want deep analytics in both economics, organizational behavior, things like machine learning, coding even, and APIs. So that analytic capability, and then the programming to make that, functional, part of your digital transformation. And then they also want people with acute business acumen, to be able to understand how to run initiatives, understand building business plans, communicating to senior executives, and kind of garnering the consensus that you need in the organization, but also externally to your external platform ecosystem. So the demands on these kinds of roles are quite stunning, and it's extremely difficult to find one person that can meet all of these capabilities. And so a lot of companies turn to building platform teams. So let me give you an example of one company that's doing that, and that's Thomson Reuters. They've really been on a 10-year journey to evolve a platform strategy. Starting, they began before 2010, but the big announcement was in September 2010 when they announced the establishment of ICON, which was taking all of their financial data on publicly traded companies and really creating an ecosystem and making it possible for third parties to build applications that enhance the value of that. And they grew that to over 20,000 external developers and the APIs necessary to drive that. And then in 2018, they spun that out as a separate company, which was called Refinitiv. And then in 2019, this was bought by the London Stock Exchange for $27 billion. So that strategy seems to have worked. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the last year of their postings around platforms, they've been a very active player in seeking platform talent. They've posted over 65 positions in 5 different countries around the world. And so this map shows you this both in terms of the geographic spread, but also the seniority level. They're looking for entry-level folks, associates, director, as well as mid-senior level. So they're really trying to populate the entire organization. So to conclude here, let me throw out some key issues and recommendations. when you look at the recruiting side, you find that there are actually not any that I can discern of recruiting companies that specialize in platform talent. There are plenty that are out there looking for digital talent, but we would argue that there are really special, unique characteristics of the folks that you need to drive your platform strategy. So there seems to be an opportunity to create a specialty practices to help the recruiters, because some of the job postings that you see, they claim they're looking for platform talent, but the descriptions that they're writing aren't very good. And so there may be a disconnect between what the firm is seeking in terms of what the leadership has announced as their strategy. And then by the time it gets through HR down to the recruiters, there may be a disconnect. So tightening that up could be very valuable. You also see that large incumbents faced some of the highest challenges. It's not sufficient to hire just one or two people in a very large organization. Like a financial institution like JP Morgan has an IT spend of over $9 billion. So hiring one person into an organization of that size does you very little. So you need to really hire in a programmatic way, similar to what Refinitiv or Thomson Reuters had done. And so you see the incumbents that are really pushing a platform strategy, launching platform hiring programs, but it's not exactly clear if that is completely well orchestrated and how coherent the hiring strategy is, and also how that matches up with internal training. Because you can't get all of your talent just by hiring from outside. You're going to have to do a lot of internal training, not just the people that you hire on board, but the people that are going to be affected by and need to come on board to your platform strategy. And then finally, there's no platform talent certification that you might see. The big data field has gotten onto this, and now you can get certifications for big data. But platform, you don't see that. So there could be an opportunity to create a badging or credentialing system in this space that would help better match supply and demand. So with that, let me turn it over to Marshall.
Thanks, Peter. I look forward to doing this. Let's see if this works. I'm afraid we're all trying this Texas two-step, four-step process. So I want to make sure that we're actually getting.
I didn't get it quite right at the beginning.
So let's see if this works. So first, sharing the slides. I hope that's working for everybody.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there's the first step. Now, are you seeing the correct display, or are you seeing the presenter?
You're in full screen. Take it away.
It is full screen?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay. So I'd like to cover three separate things. And one of these is to first just interpret the news for you to see what's happening in a couple of platforms around the world. Second thing is to actually adapt strategies for smaller firms or larger firms. How would you make investments based on what's happening in the world? For example, it seems as though entertainment is a particularly good thing these days with everyone staying at home. Is that the case, or why might that not be the case? And then what's happening in the policy analysis? We've done some formal modeling of those kinds of things. We might actually lead to some social good. One of the first things I'd like to start with is what is happening with some of the platforms. If you take a look at the figure on the right, there's a really interesting graphic of QR codes that were put together by Tencent and Alibaba. And here, you can use this actually to gain access to cafes, shopping malls, and restaurants. It's actually quite interesting. And it's green if you're relatively safe, but it might actually then turn yellow if you've been in the hot zone, or red if you've reported symptoms. But it gains you access or denies you access to different parts of the world. I also want to mention, by the way, that this part of this presentation is put together by Connie Chen, who's being with us later this afternoon, has an extensive set of background on what's happening there. So I do hope you'll ask her questions about that this afternoon. Interesting things that come out about that is in Apple and Google's case, they've now started cooperating at the operating system layer, so you can actually trace one device to another and see who might have been exposed. This raises fascinating privacy questions, because one of the issues is going to be, will these tracing phenomena disappear post-COVID-19? Unlike an app, this is at the operating system layer, so it's much harder to remove. You can imagine, police actually asking, which group have you been visiting, or which protest have you attended? And that information would be stored. And so it's an interesting question how much that will still be around. Also, interesting scale question. really the antitrust issues. I mean, in China, of course, Tencent and Alibaba are huge. Here in the United States, Apple and Google collectively cover 98% of mobile. That's quite remarkable. You wouldn't be able to get that coordination if there were a couple of dozen companies. So it's an interesting question, but whether or not there are benefits to some of these large companies and what you can actually do to create some value. There's also interesting tensions going on. A lot of you have heard about data nationalism, data residency requirements, but many of you may not also been following what's been happening between India and China. There've been some skirmishes over the border. As a result of that, the Indians have now banned several of the platform technology applications, such as WeChat, QQ, which is for instant messaging, or TikTok, Baidu Maps, Translate, and Weibo, which is their version of Twitter in there. It's quite interesting. Of course, fascinatingly enough, the Chinese are now crying foul for censorship, which has no irony whatsoever. But it is interesting that these now are gaining national attention at the platform level, and even the governance and interaction is an open question. Something else that's also been much in the news. For the first time ever, Twitter has now fact-checked some voter fraud questions or tweets that have been issued by the president, or Facebook removed hate speech icons, and Reddit banned the Donald subreddit for hate speech. In consequence, Donald Trump then signed an executive order to try to curb the protections of Section 230, the law in the United States that absolves platforms for decisions they make regarding the editorial content of the users that they post. It's quite interesting how these have proceeded in politics. For example, Jack Dorsey has said that Twitter will not accept any political advertising whatsoever. This is interesting and challenging, because how does a newcomer gain a following if they can't advertise at all? At the other extreme, Mark Zuckerberg won't do any policing at all. He said, basically, it shouldn't be the province of the platforms to be the arbiters of truth. So in general, you can pretty much post opinions as you like. What's interesting, of course, is that the conservatives feel that they're being unfairly censored and are now moved to a large extent. I think Ted Cruz, Trump, and a couple of others are now moving to Parler, which is a conservative-friendly site that says it won't censor the president's tweets or other things of that sort. This has led to a lot of interesting controversy. In fact, the Stop Hate for Profit movement has garnered about 500 different firms that have said they would stop advertising, or at least put the pause button on advertising on Facebook to see if it makes a difference. For those of you who may not have noticed this actually is one of the lead advocates for this turns out to be Jim Steyer, the older brother of Tom Steyer, the fellow that ran for president. It's quite interesting. Initially, it did have some impact. This shaved 75 billion off the stock price of Facebook. That a number is in fact larger than the total assets or market capitalization of Twitter. So it's really quite a hit. And yet over time, that seems to have come back. So it would be really interesting to see what happens over with the policies in general. Moving to a little bit of the tools and strategy, we wanted to provide some advice for firms. I know a number of you out in the audience are actually interested in becoming platform firms. And so there's a question of, well, what does it take? What resources do you need, and what are the decisions to do that? So we put together a couple of thoughts on precisely how to do that. The first question you must ask is, will your market transform to a market that is a platform-friendly market? Of course, platforms always beat products in any market where the two compete. But we have to understand, is it going to be? In this case, it's really a question of, will it be inverted firms? So that is, how much of the value is information? How modular is it so that third parties can add value? A Boeing aircraft is so complex, they have a hard time doing it. It's very hard for third parties to add value. Or is it safe for experimentation? If the market is going to transform, then there are two subsequent questions. Can you tip the market? Do you have the resources to actually tip the network effects? And can you control the relationship? If the answers to both of those questions are true, then absolutely, you should run full steam ahead and try to be the platform. If the answer to either of those questions is negative, then you might try to actually build a coalition. In this case, maybe you can create a federated platform. In this case, Visa is a collection of member banks, or Hulu was set up by member content companies together. So then you might be able to federate a platform. If you can't build a coalition, then in fact, you're probably doomed to be a product on someone else's platform. So this at least is a way of thinking through the different ways you might actually articulate where you might fall in that platform space. Another really interesting question is, where should you choose your products in here? So you might think that entertainment would be big these days with everyone sheltering at home. What's interesting, of course, it goes back to the definition of a platform. It's a open architecture with rules of governance to facilitate interactions. And what you would like to do is either high value interactions. In the content space, high value interactions at the head of the long tail might be Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad or Sopranos. Alternatively, you might actually try high volume interactions. In this case, it might be YouTube or TikTok, extremely high volume in there. An added advantage is that third parties are creating your content. Again, this is the inverted firm where you get huge numbers of different parties building out your ecosystem. Unfortunately for Quibi, what they've chosen is low value, low volume in this case. It's the mid-tail content. If you could see this, you can actually understand why it is they haven't been meeting their numbers, because they're neither fish nor fowl. They are neither the value strategy nor the volume strategy. They're kind of in between. So you really need to focus on the high value interactions or the high volume interactions if you're going to do it. Another common question, and here I'd actually like to turn to some real serious and rigorous analysis that we've done, is what platform investments actually grow the network effects or actually grow the value of your firm? If these platforms are built on network effects, where's the value coming from? How are we going to do it? Should we market to acquire new users? Or perhaps maybe we can discount to attract a user base. Or maybe we should design network effects to create additional value. Or maybe there are architectural controls that we can implement to reduce switching costs and multi-homing to keep users on the platform. I have to give credit to a PhD student with whom did this, Joe. We've analyzed Groupon's data for a full year, 150 different markets, 1,800 values. Found that the baseline value, so the marginal incremental value of an individual user, was about $54. We could then go through the 10K reports and look at some of the data to analyze a couple of different strategies. So if you take a look, for example, at marketing to acquire different users, it turns out after you consider the full customer acquisition cost, it actually is net negative. Another thing we looked at is we looked at the price elasticities. What happens if you lower prices a little bit? Here, again, it's not quite profitable. In fact, you might actually want to raise price a little bit as opposed to lower price. What's interesting is you start to get far greater leverage if you start to design network effects. Imagine, for example, you can use the data of one merchant to help improve the operations of another merchant, then that might be a way in which partners are creating value for other partners. Then if you really get very deep into it, if you can keep control of the relationship, so the relationship stays with you, in that case, the value is rather extraordinarily different. If you're interested in this, we've got a full paper, Users Drive Platform Value. So it's a huge difference, order of magnitude difference in value. The takeaway here is at least twofold. One is this order of magnitude difference in the architectural design for platforms as opposed to just the marketing for platforms. Also, in reference to some of the work that Peter mentioned, you're going to want to hire talent that is capable of doing the things over toward the right as you actually build out your firms. To give you a little bit more context, or again, if you don't believe this, let's take a look at the analysis of the two different companies. In Groupon, you redeem your coupon with the merchant off platform. And here's the problem. Once you have had the haircut or the oil change or the pizza, you can go direct to the merchant without ever going through Groupon again. And Groupon then has to build the relationship afresh each time. It's in effect a leaky bucket. You get the customer and you lose them to the merchant. You get the customer and you lose them to the merchant. By contrast, that firm that Jeff highlighted earlier that had grown explosively in China, you can handle the order and scheduling through the platform. You can handle delivery through the platform, payment through the platform. They designed network effects. The data can be used to tell you which products sell and which products don't sell. You can identify consumers within a kilometer radius that are likely to purchase from you. And Meituan takes the data and recommends to stores new locations that are underserved, creating immense value. Again, partners are creating value for other partners using that data, in effect, a network effect. To give it more salience, Meituan, on a per capita basis, has 5 times the value of the users of Groupon, and its market capitalization is 56 times the market value of Groupon. Design of network effects, design of platform strategies works. There's some really interesting results on that. So turning to some of the policy questions. So look at the fake news and some of the antitrust and some of the larger questions here. I'm delighted to say that we've been a part of this conversation. So we were in DC for the Section 230 hearings. We were talking about nurturing innovation versus fostering unaccountability. That is, as you might recognize, Bill Barr with a particular perspective on this. And then our paper with Jeff and Yorgos Petropoulos was presented at Scola, where Minister Vestager was actually speaking on these very issues with some really interesting questions. So how do we address some of these issues of speech and of antitrust? What's challenging is that the traditional tests of antitrust just don't work in the platform world. One of the first questions is market share dominance. If you've got market share, is it high and then has it been abused? But here's a question. Is Google in search or maps or self-driving cars? Is Amazon in electronic commerce or cloud services or grocery business? Those boundaries are extremely indistinct. The next test is often moving from competitive markets to, from oligopoly to duopoly to monopoly. Are they restricting output in order to raise the prices? But Facebook isn't restricting your posts. Amazon's not restricting your sales. Google's not restricting your searches. We're not getting the kinds of restricted output that you would normally get. Well, what about prices? Are prices unusually high? So you've got a small, or snip test, a small but significant increase in price? Or is there predatory pricing so that you can actually drive competitors out and actually take over the market? Well, it's fascinating. Again, we did some of the original research on two-sided markets. The price is 0 in this case, and that is the profit maximizing price as you charge a different side of the market. So again, for all the traditional tests, antitrust doesn't work. If we look at the analysis a little more carefully, we can actually use these concepts of the inverted firm where third parties are creating value outside the firm as opposed to inside. And we come up with a formal couple of observations. It's often been argued, even indeed in the presidential election in the United States, that the platform breakup, and we'd actually argue breakup fragments the user base, reducing the scale of network effects and the things we were just showing you. Yes, it does create competition, which could affect prices, but those are already 0. The challenge is that it destroys value by affecting production. That is, it's harder to use the data from one group to another to actually create value. The second thing is that things like GDPR, indeed, they do restore privacy, but they create islands of negotiation and islands of hidden information, overall reducing value. We need to ask the question, how do you create value, and then how do you actually reduce it? There's actually some research at Boston University that shows that the industry concentration has actually risen post-GDPR. Competition has actually gone down as the incumbents become even more entrenched. I want to give you a formal intuition as to why some of these interventions don't work and what better ones would be. And of course, this is presented through MIT, so we have to give you at least one equation, but I promise you it's one everyone should understand. So, how is value created in a platform? Everyone should recognize Metcalfe's law. It's very straightforward, right? It rises effectively, exponentially, or in this case, as a quadratic. Now we ask the question, what would happen if you split the company into 3 separate firms, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp? It's really straightforward. A very, very simple analysis to show each one is a third, but you square it, you get 3 back. You've got a third of the total value. You can't take value from one division and use it to create value for other divisions, or as in the Meituan case, learning from one store to actually help another store. You actually remove that value. But this plot suggests there are other kinds of interventions which could work. So I'm not arguing we shouldn't intervene. Of course we might want to intervene. Of course we want to increase social value. These are really important questions. So how might we do that? Maybe we can grant competitive access to data across the network. And here we have a model from Europe, actually in the open banking legislation, PSD2. Under this legislation, you are allowed to actually grant access to other parties, and you have the power to grant that permission. What this does is it invites third parties in to come in and create value on your behalf using your data. In this case, you're adding ecosystem partners as opposed to subtracting ecosystem partners. And here you can see in a really simple intuition, adding and then squaring it, you can create much more value. In effect, we can combine an old idea from antitrust as an essential facilities doctrine with some of these data access ideas, which should all be able to give us much more powerful interventions in ways that create value as opposed to ways that actually destroy value. I want to then cover one last topic, which goes into one of the things that we talked about earlier, which is about lies in political ads. Is there a way to do it? In fact, we can use some incredibly powerful principles of information economics and platform economics to offer one possible solution. So here's one that we're proposing, okay? How about politicians simply warrant their claims in ads by placing a certain amount in escrow? In this case, then you allow third-party fact check. And it's a very straightforward process where if the claims are never challenged, then the pledge is refunded. Or if the claims are challenged and they turn out to be true, then the pledge is refunded. Now, everyone always asks the question, of course, well, who gets to decide? In fact, we've already solved that problem. We use the exact same mechanism that we're already using for our own government, which is we split the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive branches. So one group gets to define fake news or false ads. You could even get Fox News and CNN to agree on perhaps the definition, but they don't get to adjudicate. Then the fact checkers get to adjudicate using the predefined definition. Note this is even stronger than current conditions. At the moment, they get to use their own definition, but now we'd have to use the independently decided definition. Then Facebook would be the executor. Notice the elegance of this in the sense that no party has a bias in this, in the sense that they're actually favored in who gets to make the decision, and no party has an economic incentive to decide in their own interest. Facebook isn't the arbiter, they simply are the executor. Notice that this also has an interesting property. Honest ads have no costs whatsoever. In contrast, lies are expensive, in this case, because you keep forfeiting pledges. How do we know when a product is valuable, right? If we take a phone or a piece of architecture or whatever comes with a guarantee, right? You know that a high quality product is one that comes with a guarantee, where a low quality product comes as is or comes with no guarantee whatsoever. So for those of you that are complaining about your politicians, you might, in some sense, might have only yourselves to blame. You have in effect bought politicians with no guarantee, and you can't return them when they break. So this ought to be a mechanism of using some information economics and also some network economics to see if we can help solve some of those problems. So for any of this set of research, so if you're interested in some of the articles that are in supply side and demand side shocks, then you can take a look at the winning the race for survival. If you want to look at the antitrust issues, here's the research. If you're looking at the truth markets for false ads or the platform talent, or if you want to look at these questions of how users create platform value, you can find this research on ssrn.com. And so with that, I think it's time to take some questions. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Marshall. We do have a couple of questions, and I'll try to point them in one direction or another, but others should feel free to weigh in. We've only got about 5 minutes. So, Jeff, during your session, a question came in about what happens when consumers own and/or control their personal data and databases and will share it only with trusted brands that use private edge AI. Marshall pointed to one potential solution in his deck, but curious about your response.
Yeah, so that's actually a terrific question, and it gets into transaction costs, because if the consumers own your own data, which is part of the regulatory framework that's emerging, it's very hard for them to make that data available on the terms that they want. So what we would expect to see is the emergence of essentially agents or middlemen who could be intermediaries to then bargain on behalf of consumers with the other brands and platforms to use the data on the terms that they find acceptable. And then you can aggregate across numerous consumers and their data. So great question.
Peter, there are a bunch of questions that came in about the human resource component of platforms. A couple of them are more about bias. One was platform investors are doing well, gig workers are getting laid off. what's the role of platforms in increasing wealth inequality. Be interested to hear about what organizations are seeking platform talent and their further thoughts on training. And lastly, what about recruiting after COVID and posting on different cities where we're all remote now and may well be for some time? Pick any one or jump on them all.
Wow, great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the gig worker question has moved into the policy realm where different jurisdictions are beginning to set up different regimes. The work that we were doing is really around platform management, so less on the worker side than on who's running the platforms. And actually, this work has actually led me to think that there may be a need now for maybe a section of a course on platform ethics and platform management. We do teach platform strategy, but kind of what does it take to run a platform? There's also a lot of work that needs to be done on corporate training around platforms and what kind of curriculum makes sense. And also for professional career development, is there opportunities to add a platform dimension? This research demonstrates, there's just growing demand for this type of work, and it's an exciting career. So it's a really interesting opportunity.
Thanks, Peter. And Marshall, just 60 seconds left. There's a question about how Alibaba in China worked with the government to thwart COVID. Do you think that the US government could do so with Twitter, Facebook, or the US platforms?
I like that question, and I actually think they can and they should. Personally, I think that we could be doing an awful lot more. And if you simply look at the rate of spread of COVID in the United States relative to most other industrialized countries, we're not slowing the spread as much as we could. And I think it would be wonderful if we actually work with some of those platforms to try to stop that spread. So that would absolutely be a yes.
Awesome, thank you. There are a couple of other questions that we'll address offline. I appreciate that very much. And I wanted to now turn it over to Marshall to give an introduction of Dr. Bush, please. Marshall?